Hey there! Welcome to the second video in this video lecture series presented to you by Project Pustakalaya, a non-profit initiative that aims to make quality education accessible for all. In this video, we continue exploring Psychology 101, and we begin with major theoretical approaches, the second topic in this series. So, we'll broadly be covering around 8 approaches to psychology in this video. These are the approaches that even modern psychology today uses. So, they may have had historical origins, but today they are used by psychologists around the world. The first approach we have is the psychoanalytic approach. Now, this approach is also known as the psychodynamic approach. Excuse the mistake on the slide. And it was developed by Sigmund Freud. Now, this approach is probably what you first think of when you think of psychology. Because, for instance, if I tell you to picture psychology in your mind, you're probably thinking of someone lying down on a couch and a therapist talking to them about the way they feel. That's exactly what Sigmund Freud did. This is exactly how his approach functioned. What he would do is he would have people lay down on a couch and he'd listen to them talk about their feelings, talk about their thoughts, and then analyze those. And that brings us to two key words that were important in the way that he analyzed how people thought. One was the unconscious, and second is free association. Now, the unconscious refers to the idea that there is an aspect or a part of your brain that influences the way you act, even without you knowing that it even exists, or these are thoughts that you never knew existed but impact the way that you think today. And this often relates to the idea of repressed memories. Now, you'll understand this better with an example in just a second, but before that, let's cover the second keyword, which is free association, for which I want to show you this meme or well a snippet from a film. You probably recognize this as a scene from Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara, and if you watch that film, you know that there's a scene where Kabir's character acts as a psychologist and has this game where he says out words and asks another person to associate the first word that comes in their mind. For instance, he says, "I'll say a word," and you have to say the first thing that comes to your mind. And this is when Hrithik Roshan's character says, "In my opinion, Dr. Sigmund Freud." So that's the reference they're trying to make to psychology here. But what they're actually trying to show you is the very idea of free association. Free association is the idea of psychologists or therapists asking people to associate words with the things that first pop up in their mind when they hear them. And it's actually quite interesting. It's a game you should play with your friends, your parents, whenever you have time. But let's look at this through an example now. If a psychoanalytic psychologist had to explain introversion or why a person is introverted, they would do this by saying that these people avoid social situations or avoid going out to parties, for instance, because they have a repressed memory of trauma. For instance, maybe when they were 8 or 9, they went for a party and were embarrassed. Perhaps they spilled something all over themselves. Anything could have happened, but it is because they believe that they embarrassed themselves in the past, they have negative memories associated with this, that this is a repressed memory deep down, that their unconscious tells them not to go out. That's the way a psychoanalytic psychologist would look at this. And keep this example in mind because we're going to use the idea of introversion and extroversion to understand various approaches in this video. Let's go on to the second approach, which is the cognitive approach. This is fairly straightforward. Cognitive refers to the mind. So the cognitive approach refers to the way that we think and the way we behave. Now, the cognitive approach believes that the way we think impacts the way we behave, and the way we behave impacts the way we think. Let's use the same example here. How would a cognitive psychologist explain someone choosing to be extroverted or introverted? The questions they would ask is, or does the individual or does this person think of offers for conversation as important ways to get to know someone? Does this person think that a conversation with another person is fun? Is it a way to get to know someone better? Or do they think of a conversation as a burden, as something they have to carry out to look socially acceptable? If it's the case of the former, where they think of a conversation as an opportunity, they're likely to be extroverts. If they think of a conversation as a burden, they're likely to be introverts. Next, we have the humanistic approach. Two important people who are going to pop up later in this video series, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, are pivotal to this approach, specifically the humanistic approach. Now, the title gives away a lot. It actually is the approach that treats humans as humans, basically. It looks at potential for growth, and the scope for humans to grow in the long run and to improve themselves. So, two important words that come up when we discuss the humanistic approach are free will and self actualization. So, humanistic psychologists believe that people should have, or do inherently have, the ability to take their own decisions, and that they should be the masters of their own fate, the captains of their own soul. Self actualization refers to the ability of people to be able to achieve their maximum potential. Now, let's look at the humanistic approach in the context of an introverted person. Now, an introverted person may choose to limit their contact with others because they believe that their social needs are better satisfied by contact with a few people rather than large groups. So, this is where the idea of free will plays in, right? Humanistic psychologists believe that all people have free will, and so people who are introverted choose this free will to make the decision that whether to make the decision to stay with a close knit group of people, because they believe that their social needs, the needs they have in terms of um, what they can get from the society around them or their community, are better fulfilled by knowing a few close friends rather than having a large group of friends. Therefore, they choose to stay introverted and not spend a lot of time socializing or going to things like large parties or gatherings. Next, we have the evolutionary approach, and this does have roots in Charles Darwin's original evolutionary theories. And basically, the evolutionary approach, if you remember from our last video on functionalism, looks at every trait as the purpose it serves in survival. What this means is that it looks at the purpose that every action, every behavior plays, and whether or not that behavior impacts or is influential in survival. Let's look at that same extroverted person. um, an extroverted person, an evolutionary psychologist at least would say, is outgoing because they think they can make friends and allies. These allies, these friends, are connections that could help them improve their chances of survival in the case of an event that threatens their survival. Next, the biological approach. Now, the biological approach is one that is based strictly on science. It believes that all sorts of behavior that you see come directly as a result of chemical processes, physical processes going on inside your body. And they believe that behavior equals genetics plus physiology. Simple as that. Now, if a biopsychologist, which is what you'd call someone who believes in the biological approach, had to explain someone who is extroverted, they would say this is because they had genes that they inherited from their parents, and those genes affect chemicals in their brain, which are called neurotransmitters, by the way, which we will get to into later videos. Next, the socio-cultural approach. If you had to break this word down, it's society and culture, which pretty much explains what this approach is. Um, it basically believes that the way we think and behave, both of these factors are affected by which culture we come from, what area of the world we call home, how is it that our identity plays into the way we think and behave. An example of this would be greetings, for instance. If you're Indian, you most likely, in traditional settings, use a namaste as a greeting, or at least that's something that is traditionally a part of our culture. But if you're American, for instance, a handshake seems more appropriate. So this is something that varies across cultures. But now, if a socio-cultural psychologist had to explain extroversion, or why a particular person is an extrovert, they would look at or examine that person's culture. They would ask questions like, how far apart do people in this particular culture stand when they have a conversation? Do they typically shake hands? Do they prefer to keep a distance? Things like that. And that would lead them as to why is it that this person is also an extrovert, if that is what their what is if that is what the rest of their culture points to, or why they are introverts, if that is what the rest of their culture points to. We're almost there. Now we have the behavioral approach. I have summed this up pretty simply here. It's rewards and punishments. And that's because this is something that the rest of this video series is really going to go into a lot of depth about. You'll read about people like Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. So that's something for later videos. But to explain this to you briefly, the behavioral approach looks at behavior as a result of consequence. What happened the last time you did this particular action, or showed this particular behavior? Were you rewarded for it or were you punished for it? Let's look at the example of introversion versus extroversion. A behavioral psychologist would ask the questions: was this person rewarded the last time they went out? Were they rewarded for being outgoing and social? Were they punished from withdrawing from social situations? Maybe that's what caused them to be extroverts. The way they were rewarded, maybe, for going outside and going to parties and large gatherings. Or maybe they were punished for staying inside the house too long. Those are all factors that play in to behavioral psychologists analyzing behavior. Next, we have, and the last one, the biopsychosocial approach. Yes, that is certainly a mouthful to say, but it's actually a pretty simple approach because it's a blend of a lot of the previous approaches that we just saw. Specifically, looking at how our culture and biology together shape us. So it's a mix of the biological and the sociocultural approach. Now, if a biopsychosocial psychologist had to explain extroversion, they would do that by looking at a variety of factors. They would look at genes, for instance. Does this person have genetic tendency for extroversion? Are their parents extroverts? This is how the biopsychological school of thought would explain this. But then they'd also ask, how has this person been conditioned? Is this something that their culture has taught them? Is this something that society has, through social pressure or conformity or influence, impacted them to do? Those are questions that the biopsychosocial school of thought would have. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope this was helpful. Wait around for our next video on research methods and ethics in psychology. See you next time.